Hi everyone. So it's the time of the year when a lot of master's students are beginning to write their dissertation as part of their degree. And I thought I'd just give a brief overview of the kind of advice that I give my students when they're setting out on this journey in terms of how to figure out what their research question is. Now, this is also advice that I give to my PhD students too. So if you are a PhD student, hopefully you'll find what I'm saying in this interesting and helpful as well. It's actually also advice I try and use myself when I'm trying to figure out what exactly it is I'm trying to say or what exactly it is I want to say in an article and I'm a bit stuck. I tend to use this method. Now, this is just one method. There are potentially other different methods. You might get different advice from your supervisor. Obviously prioritize the advice that your specific supervisor has given you, but nevertheless, hopefully some of you might find what I'm saying in this video helpful. So in terms of a research question, that's ultimately what a dissertation is, or what a PhD is. It's an answer to a question, but it's a question that we find and that we ask ourselves. So it's different to say an essay part or an exam part of an assessment of a module, which generally speaking, the lecturer or your course leader has drafted those questions. In a dissertation, usually we're required to find that question for ourselves. And it's important to have a question. And I think these reasons set out here explain why. But firstly, a question, it helps us with more analytical writing. It stops us from writing far too descriptively on a topic. So, for example, let's say we have a specific topic that we're interested in. Let's say, for example, emergency powers. And I'm giving that example because that's the area that I work on. We might be interested in emergency powers, but trying to figure out what to include or exclude in a 15,000 word dissertation can be difficult to do. And a question helps us narrow our focus and helps us figure out what information is relevant or irrelevant to that question that's asked. So we might be focusing on emergency powers, but by having a question, it requires us to focus on particular aspects of emergency powers that will help us answer that question. So it helps us then from avoiding this overly descriptive uh, dissertation, and it helps us then to figure out what to include and exclude and then to write more analytically, so more critically, because we're trying to answer the question. So again, we're not just doing a memory dump of information or a knowledge dump of information. We're using that information and directing it towards the question that was asked. The question also helps us to stick within the word count. For a master's dissertation, it's going to be usually it's around 12 to 15,000 words. For a PhD, it could be upwards on 80 to 100,000 words. But nevertheless, having a specifically narrow enough question for a PhD is of vital importance. It's of vital importance. Again, you might think 80 to 100,000 words gives us a lot of space to write about a lot of things, but hopefully on your PhD journey, you realize actually just how much you don't actually know, how much you need to not include. And that question as well is fundamentally important to help you get to that original contribution to knowledge requirement, which is what you need for a PhD. So it's important as well that we have a question that's narrow enough that we can answer within our word limit. So for that master's dissertation, that it's narrow enough to answer within 15,000 words. If your question is too broad, chances are you're still going to end up with this overly descriptive dissertation. You're going to end up raising more questions than you're actually answering. You're going to end up with an answer that is far too broad and is lacking that analytical depth that we're looking for in a dissertation. If it's too broad, you're going to really struggle to figure out what to include and what to exclude. So the key, therefore, is to get our question as narrow as possible that we can answer within our specific word count. And the way I like to do this, and the way I've been taught to do this, and the way I teach my students to do this, is to try and break up our research question into lots of different smaller questions. It's to problematize the problem. It's to try to realize that actually this big problem, this big topic that we're looking at, is actually made up of lots of different smaller topics. So I'm going to give you a kind of, a simple example of this. And then I'm going to give you a more detailed example, perhaps, from the area that I work in. Okay, so a very simple example is, of a big question being made up of lots of smaller questions. Is this example of how do I build a house? Okay, there's our question. I want to figure out how to build a house, and I want to do it myself. So there's our question. But we actually realize that there are lots of different steps that we need to answer first in order to be able to answer this big question. For example, how do I dig foundations? Okay, but then, how do you dig foundations raises actually these three further questions. There's probably even more questions that it raises. How do I drive a digger, for example? How deep do the foundations need to be? How do I map out where the foundations go? So straight away, just on this one question, how do I build a house? We've got this further question, how do I dig foundations? And then we have even further sub questions that we can answer and that we can explore. Likewise, how do I lay bricks? We can break this up into even further questions. How do I make mortar? What kind of mortar do I need? How do I keep the bricks straight? How do I cut the bricks? What type of trowel should I use? What does pointing mean? Okay, so you can see how these are just two sub-questions of that bigger questions of how do I build a house. And as you can see, you can even break these sub-questions into even smaller questions. And you can potentially break these even smaller questions into further smaller questions. So really what we're doing here is we're splitting up one question into lots of different smaller questions and splitting that smaller question into even smaller questions. And the journey in your dissertation writing, the journey in your PhD writing is the same. It's finding a big question, a big research topic area, for example, and trying to break that into questions, breaking those questions into further sub-questions, and then answering those kind of narrower questions. So to give a more maybe concrete legal example, this is one kind of I've just done up roughly from the area of emergency powers, which is the area that I work in. So there's our topic. I want to write a dissertation on emergency powers, or I want to write a PhD on emergency powers. I don't actually know what I want to say. How do I break it up? So one way in which you can think, and throughout this, what you're going to be doing is reading, and trying to figure out where the gap in the literature is that you want to address. For an LLM, for a master's dissertation, finding a gap in the literature is helpful, but just be aware, your LLM doesn't have to be an original contribution to knowledge. That's the test for a PhD. Your master's dissertation doesn't have to be at that level. So just be aware. But finding gaps in the literature can be a helpful way of thinking about things in terms of questions. But here's my broad area of emergency powers. I want to write my dissertation on this. Okay, maybe we can split this up into different questions. Well, we can raise the question of maybe what type of emergency powers are we talking about? Or we might want to think about, what controls on emergency powers? Because, my own perspective, or maybe your own perspective is, I'm a bit concerned, I'm concerned about emergency powers. I'm concerned about abuse of emergency powers. So maybe my focus, as a result of my interest, is driving me towards looking at controls on emergency powers. In terms of types of emergency powers, well, maybe we could look at powers that are contained in legislation, or maybe we could look at powers contained in constitutions. Maybe we could explore the differences between the two. What's the advantages and disadvantages of one over the other? That might be one avenue in which we go down. Or when we're looking at controls on emergency powers, we might think, well, maybe we should have time limits on them, automatic sunset clauses. Maybe we could explore the effectiveness, validity, human rights implications of those time limits. That might be one way in which we can do. Or maybe we're looking at, well, maybe we might want to be looking at some legal oversight, some judicial oversight of these exercise of these powers. And actually, from our reading, and we're digging into this area further, we realize, there might actually be something, a common thread linking all of this that I'm interested in exploring further. And that question, that issue of I'm interested in, is fundamentally important, because it's that interest that's going to drive and you're narrowing down of your focus. There are lots of different choices that you could take, each one potentially equally valid. But the one that you should pick should be the one I think that you're most interested in, because that's going to be the one that you're going to be most willing to read more up on if you're interested in that topic. But in terms of linking this, maybe we see that actually there's another question that's animating all of this, and it might be that question of who decides that emergency powers are needed. And you're like, oh, okay, so I've sort of narrowed it down. Who decides that emergency powers are needed? So we have some limitation there, we're some narrowing there, but that's still quite big. Who should decide? That's still very, very, very big. So maybe we were doing a bit more reading and we're summarizing up the different arguments, and that's what this slide does here. We've different arguments from the pro-legislature, the executive and the judicial side. The legislature, for example, tends to be, it comes from it's got strong democratic perspective, but it can be weak in terms of secrecy. In the UK, you've got 650 MPs, not even talking about the House of Lords. Usually the legislature is quite slow, and actually when it does decide things quite rapidly, that does potentially undermine its legitimacy in terms of procedural legitimacy. So its advantages are democratic, but its disadvantages are, well, it should be slower. There's also a problem in terms of how it protects minority rights, particularly in a time of emergency, counter-terrorism, where you do have this democratic pressure for vengeance or for scapegoating of a suspect community. So there are issues there. The executive, on the other hand, is very, maybe not as democratic as the legislature, depending upon the country, but it can act swiftly. It has the key advantage of deciding in secret, but again, it mightn't be able to value minority rights. And this question of deciding in secret can be quite important in the area of emergencies, particularly in the context of national security, because if you disclose these secrets in public, you're potentially undermining national security. Or at least that's the way the argument goes. And then the judiciary, well, the weaknesses of the judiciary is that it's undemocratic, tends to be quite slow again. It also decides cases in public for the most part, but it's often, sometimes it's considered to be the body that's best placed to protect minority rights because they're insulated from these democratic pressures, this rally rant, well, whether it is or not is a different question. But generally speaking, it's insulated from those political forces that may encourage the scapegoating or vilification of minorities. And so we realize there are these maybe three key themes or three key strengths that each of these bodies have. And again, you can take issue with this and you can disagree with this. That's absolutely fine. You can go down that route of disagreeing. Maybe disagree with the argument that the judiciary is best placed to protect rights in time of emergency. That would be one question. But just going down this journey, just to show you how to do the breaking up into smaller questions. Well, we see that the legislature's strength maybe is democracy, the executive strength is security or secrecy, and the judiciary's strength is rights. And I'm thinking, well, is there a way in which, doing my rating and we think, well, is there a way in which we can marry the judiciary's strength in terms of protecting of rights while also potentially addressing some of these problems around secrecy and security, etc. And maybe one way in which this might raise the question, maybe, to balance this relation between rights and security, should the judiciary be allowed to decide cases in secret? So there's a question that we could potentially explore. And so we're narrowing our focus down even further as to whether, maybe in emergencies, judiciaries could be allowed to decide cases in secret. This then would going to raise even further questions. What type of cases? Are we talking about civil cases? Or are we talking about criminal cases? We're doing a reading of criminal, the arguments for and against, and we do see maybe, there was an example recently, or maybe not too recently, of a criminal case that was held almost entirely in secret, or an infidel. We'll read a bit more about that. And maybe we're thinking about this idea of balance, which is a concept, I'm not too keen on, like to critique quite a bit, but nevertheless, you might be thinking more of how do we recalibrate the relation between rights and security, between rights and secrecy. Well, maybe rather than having the whole trial in secret, maybe we could have parts of the trial in secret. And this is why we're doing a bit more reading, even more problematizing. We say, well, maybe we're talking about issues in relation to disclosure of evidence. Or maybe there are certain safeguards that we can have that might allow greater acknowledgement of state secrecy while at the same time allowing for some degree of oversight or some judicial check or some, fair trial checks on terms of that power. Looking at this area, perhaps you're reading a bit more and you see, oh, here are these things called closed material procedures. Here are these things called special advocates. And we're thinking, we're doing our reading, we see that they've not really been used in criminal trials at all. So maybe there's a question. Should closed material procedures and special advocates be used in criminal trials? And I think that's a question that you could potentially write a dissertation on. That's potentially narrow enough that you can write 15,000 words on. You could potentially even focus that as a topic on a PhD. But you can see how that's much narrower. We've gone from this general topic of emergency powers into this much narrower, smaller topic of whether closed material procedures and special advocates could be used in criminal trials. So we're only answering a very, very small part of this overall question about emergency powers. Now, what's the advantage of having a question and an argument? Chances are you've gone down this route in that example of the role of special advocates in criminal trials. Chances are you've been motivated by some argument to go down this route. And yes, you're answering the question, but at the stage at which you've gotten to the question and you've narrowed it down, you probably have quite a strong argument. You probably have a perspective. The reason why you focused on this question is because you do have a view about that question. This is the irony of the research project, is very often our question comes after our argument, or it's our argument that drives the question or helps us find the question. So for example, we have this argument here that, you're doing your more research on closed material procedures and you actually think, do you know what, I don't think closed material procedures should be used in criminal trials because I think they cause too much harm to a fair trial, to equality of arms, and the fact that an individual's liberty is at stake when we're talking about criminal trials, that the stakes are much higher than civil trials. So there's my argument. I don't think they should be allowed in criminal trials. So, but how do we frame that in the form of a question? Well, I think it should be quite simple. It's still, that's your answer. But the question is still, should closed procedures or special advocates be used in criminal trials? The reason why framing it in the form of a question is important is because the question helps you stay on track. The question helps you be more open and more willing to perspectives that might actually challenge your views or might actually make you change your mind. If you're focused primarily upon an argument, you run the risk that you're going to ignore perspectives that might actually challenge or counter your argument. Okay? By framing it in the form of a question, you're still leaving yourself open to those competing perspectives. Obviously, then you will come in and you'll do your rebuttal of those competing perspectives. But I think having that question just makes you a little bit more open and a little bit more willing. It also means that when you read something that does fundamentally challenge your views, you don't suddenly throw the baby out with the bathwater and think, oh my God, my argument is ruined. My dissertation can't stand, my PhD can't stand anymore because here's this amazing argument that's rejected my view. That's not the case if it's in the frame of a question. If it's in the form of a question, it's just more information that you need to take on board to reflect and to recalibrate your answer to the question. So I think that's why certainly an argument will animate and drive your formation of the question. But by thinking it in the form of a question still, it does help us to be more willing and more open to these counterpositions. And obviously a good dissertation will look at the counterpositions, will not ignore the weakness in those arguments, and will instead rebut those arguments. So ultimately, how do we find our research question? Well, quite simply, we need to read, and then we need to read some more, and then we need to keep on reading. Okay, really, that's the whole process of this. It just takes time to get there. Some other ways in which you can do it to help you see how concepts link up together is through things like spider diagrams. This is kind of what I use quite a lot, and not very often I'll do it by hand, because I find spider diagrams are really helpful for me to figure out how concepts link together. And they help me then say, oh, well, here's how this concept, how does it relate to this concept that I've not drawn any link between? And that makes me think, oh, there might be something interesting to say because there's no link here. Or conversely, by doing the spider diagrams and narrowing down, we can figure out what we need to include, what we need to exclude. So, like I said, just find out what works for you. I think spider diagrams are really helpful for me to help me find my research question. But really the key thing is this reading. And ultimately, my main advice to students is that actually the hardest part of writing a dissertation or a PhD or any kind of research project is finding the question. The easy part is answering it. And very often that question can come quite late in the day. But by the time you've gotten to that stage, you've done all that reading. You know what you want to say. You know what your argument is. And at the end of the day then, it comes quite late, but you have your argument. You've done all the research. It's just about constructing and forming and putting that information in an argument in a way that is directed towards the question asked. So yes, I'll finish on that note, is that the hardest part, I think, of any kind of research is finding your question. The easiest part is answering it. So hopefully that's been helpful. Do let me know if it has been. Like I said, I'm hoping this is of help to anyone who's doing an L&M dissertation or even an MA dissertation, and likewise for PhDs as well. Thank you.